So now to turn things over to Josh, Bryan, and Pat for the main event.
So I'm Josh Marantz. I work in Cambridge on ModPageSpeed and on PageSpeed optimization libraries, which is not strictly limited to ModPageSpeed, but that's how probably it's best known at this point. I wanted to point out three members of ModPageSpeed team sitting over there, which is Jan Mason, Matt Atterbury, and Sean Miyake. There's a few more who couldn't make it today, and there's others that contribute to the code base from elsewhere around the world. And so ModPageSpeed was basically, if you, first of all, how many people here have heard of ModPageSpeed? So most of you know basically what it is. It was launched in November of 2010. We did a meetup, a Boston Web Performance meetup, over at Wayfair, I think in December of 2010, and now we're back again, but I brought some friends. So, actually, one of the things I wanted to know is when we launched ModPageSpeed, when we kind of set on our course to launch it, we've been working on it for a while and wanted to bring it out there, but we had no idea what the reaction was going to be at all. You know, we knew that it had some benefit. We could measure that we made stuff smaller, less requests. But we didn't really have any good way of showing its value in a compelling way. And then kind of at the last minute, we learned about web page test and started to actually see what we were doing. And I think that the videos and the statistics and the data that came out of running ModPageSpeed and modified and unmodified versions of sites through web page test and seeing videos, I don't think that that launch would have made it, had not been for the product which was built by Pat Meenan. And so I wanted to also introduce Bryan, and I'll let them say a few words before we begin. But one other note, our plan today is we don't have a lot of prepared slides or anything. What we wanted to do is get you to tell us what websites you'd like to see optimized. Hopefully they're yours, but it's not necessary. And we'll just kind of do an improv up here and see how we can make them faster using PageSpeed, web page test, and ModPageSpeed, and PageSpeed service, which is the kind of ModPageSpeed in the cloud. So here's Pat.
Alrighty, so I'm Pat Meenan, created and run web page test. The dullest location, if you ever use it, is actually in my basement. Yeah, I mean, like Joshua was saying, hopefully this is going to be a really interactive effort here. Not so much us just running through stuff and presenting, and by very few slides, I think we have zero. We're planning on just working off of whatever websites you want to do, and please, everyone, jump in and help and work on it if you've got ideas, stuff you want to see, suggestions you have for the site owners. This is really much more of a hands-on, everyone work together kind of a thing than a presentation. Here's Bryan.
I'm Bryan McQuade. I am an engineer also at Google. I've worked in the space, I don't know, about 5 years now, so it's been a good while. I lead the PageSpeed analysis team in our Cambridge office. So the PageSpeed tool, PageSpeed Online and the others, and the PageSpeed Analysis SDK, which actually Pat and I got to work together to integrate in web page test before Pat joined us, which was fun. So yeah, so in addition, sort of exciting addition, myself, one of the engineers on my team, launched Mod Speedy today, the Speedy module for Apache. So we'll look at that in a little detail today and talk about that as well. How many folks are familiar with Speedy, what Speedy is? That's great. So Speedy is a protocol that improves upon, I guess, HTTP by adding a couple features. Stream multiplexing and header compression are the two sort of most important. We'll dive into that, I guess, a little later. But we think it's a really exciting way to help speed up the web.
All right, so let's start seeing some hands. Who's got websites they want to look at? And let's try and keep it PG if we could.
So I'll go ahead.
And I was going to say, if no one volunteers, you're going to start looking at some really boring sites that we have. So first, way back in the white shirt, had your hand up first.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if we could use one page speed to show why the Google homepage is fast as opposed to why certain sites are slow. Like, can we show how to pipeline or...
So the question was if we could use mod page speed to show,
Sorry, any of your...
or any of the tools to show why the Google homepage is fast, instead of showing why certain things are slow. We can certainly talk about some of that. One of the biggest reasons you're going to see is that there's nothing on it.
So we've worked a little bit with the search team, over the years, and actually learned a lot from them as well. And they've done, a bunch of things, all the standard techniques, things like chunked encoding. So they learned, when you enter a search, it takes a little bit of time to figure out what the results are. But there's a part of the page at the top that actually doesn't depend on the results at all, right? And so they figured out that, you can sort of create the perception of a faster loading page and actually get some content to the user faster by pushing that static chunk of content, the search box and so I guess the search box. Yeah, the search box, the links along the top, etc., down to the user immediately. And in parallel, you're crunching, on the back end, computing results, and then you send that down as a separate chunk. So, the primary thing is they keep the page really light. But in addition, they really try to be thoughtful about, sending as much data down, or the data that's available as soon as it's available down to the user, sort of as quickly as possible. And I suppose we could look. Do you want to do any specific questions about search or anything like that we can sort of talk about in a little more detail? Like that.
I will say some of the things not directly related to the home page per se, but that you'll start seeing in some of the other Google properties is things like image search is a particularly good one to look at for some of the more advanced techniques, where they'll inline images as data URIs and batch stuff in after the fact and things like that to make the experience really fast. So the complicated pages are somewhat more interesting in Google's case than just the home page.
Well, it's hard to say that.
And so Bryan was talking a little bit about showing the first chunk and making sure the document's getting flushed out early and all that kind of stuff. One of the big things Google definitely pushed for is the TCP initial window improvements in Linux, where if you're running a kernel older than 2639, I believe, and it's terminating your connections, it's likely only sending 4 packets of data to the client before waiting for a round trip. And in 2639, they picked up the improvements that we had pushed to make it 10 packets by default. So shoving more data down with fewer round trips is one of the things that Google and most of the large companies and accelerator providers have been doing for a while.
So I would just, recommend if you are running a Linux box to serve your content, do try to upgrade to 2639 or newer, or one of the 3.0, and you'll sort of instantly benefit from that change, which is a default on as of 2639. It went from, I think, 3 packets, which is 4.5K, to 10, which is 15K. So usually you can get the majority of your content out without waiting for a round trip. And we can talk about sort of the details of what that means maybe a little later, but I think the key takeaway is just run 2639 or newer.
It's definitely true that there's a lot less on it that is on other pages. It's a really clean design, but there's certainly a lot more on it than there used to be. But the speed hasn't really gotten worse. It's still, at least in the web page test run that I just did, it took 28 seconds to load it first view. So it's pretty good. I don't know a lot of the details. I haven't dived into this page that much because it's not really kind of the meat of what mod page speed is trying to optimize for. But I'll note a couple of things here. JavaScript, if you read the Cyrus books, will block a lot of rendering activity on the page. But you'll notice that the JavaScript is coming in mostly pretty late. there is a lot of images that get displayed before we start waiting for JavaScript to load.
And it's not even blocking on load.
And it's not blocking on load. Other things that I would notice are that the URLs have lots of funny characters in them. That's a good sign. From my perspective, that means I haven't dived into these, but they're probably cached for a while. So if you come back to the Google page, you've been to it before. That means at least there's a fighting chance that the JavaScript that you're looking for is in cache, unless it actually changed, in which case they would change the name of this URL, and it was okay to cache it for a year. Google.com just does this by the serving infrastructure kind of supports it directly, and what ModPageSpeed tries to do is take any page and make it have that property, so that all of your URLs have unique signatures in them that allow them to be cached for a year, so people that come back every day or go to other pages on the same site that might share the same resources can get the fastest resource to download is the one that's already in your cache. So these are really good signals that says that somebody's thinking about that when they're doing this page. And the people who own the Google.com homepage are thinking about that a lot.
So maybe I'm misunderstanding, but I've heard that ModPageSpeed can do spriting, like on the fly. Is that something you guys can talk about, or
Yeah.
how do you guys do that?
Yep. The question is, he's heard that ModPageSpeed can do spriting, and that is true. There is a sprite images. Let me hold this for a second.
And yeah, it came up as the first search result.
Right. So there is a sprite images filter in ModPageSpeed. We worked on that for a while. It was one of the more complicated filters that we ever built. It's not the first thing that we talk about because we haven't. We've had some trouble measuring its benefit in terms of page load time with web page test. We haven't really given up doing that. We think it definitely does find sprites to do, but it's not as impactful as some of the other things that we do. But part of the reason for this is that ModPageSpeed is due to kind of constraints in the way that CSS currently works, a bit conservative in what it's willing to sprite relative to what a human would do. And this gets into the issues of if you replace an image reference with a CSS, with kind of a section of an image, if it's not sized perfectly, then we don't know whether to stretch what's left over or truncate it or tile it. There's some ambiguity as to what we would. It's not clear what we should do to make the page look exactly right, unless the div in which the image is going to be sized. So.
And to some extent, it's the newer browsers, the support for data URIs and image inlining has helped a lot with the small images, and it's a much easier problem to solve in automation. So it sort of mitigates some of what you would normally sprite on more modern browsers anyway.
Actually, that's a very good point. That's kind of what we wound up doing very quickly after we tried spriting. We said, well, why don't we just inline images into CSS files? So we added that feature, and it was much, much easier and very effective.
How about sprites when you're trying to render your page at different devices, like say a smartphone, tablet, or a general laptop? How about sprites when you're trying to use it for laptops?
So the question was about sprites when you're using, I assume, CSS media queries and forget responsive design style stuff to serve images to different types of content.
Yeah.
I don't know that the implementation would really be any different. You'd still have sprites per. You just have to be really careful. If you haven't already, there was down at BDConf this week, there was a fair amount of talk about responsive design and how to do it right and how not to do it. And apparently, somewhere north of 90% of sites even with the responsive design and CSS media queries, are doing it such a way that all devices download all of the content, which kind of defeats the purpose. So make sure you're being very careful in measuring what you're doing if you're doing something along those lines. In particular, display none, I guess, is pretty pointless because it downloads the content. Back in the back.
Can you explain exactly what a media query is?
Sorry, explain what a media query is. It's a CSS condition where you can say for mobile devices or for screen widths between these dimensions, use this set of CSS rules. And usually with a responsive design site, you'd have a whole bunch of those for, okay, if the screen width is between 400 pixels wide and 600 pixels wide, use this bunch of CSS rules. If it's wider than 600 pixels wide, use this set of CSS rules. So as someone resizes the browser window, or if they're on a mobile device or whatever, they'll get the content appropriate for the dimensions of their screen. And in some cases, they'll get all of the other content as well, just not see it.
Anybody have any sites
Anyone
they
have
want?
sites? So in blue, we've been waiting for you for a while.
Sure, stadiumjourney.com.
Stadiumjourney.com. Journey?
Yes.
And now we all run tests at the same time.
You want to go first, Bryan?
Sure, let me get that first. So I'm going to run, you know what I may do is put that in the stand. So most of my work focuses on the sort of the page speed analysis engine, page speed online, page speed browser extensions, which is essentially an analysis tool that will look at a web page, look for to make sure that you're applying best practices, and tell you where you can make things faster, sort of very actionable feedback. It sort of complements Mod PageSpeed. Mod PageSpeed tries to do as many things as possible automatically, but as Josh mentioned, there are things that we can't confidently do and be certain that we won't break the site, and so we err on the side of safety, because we'd rather serve a site that works than a fast broken site. And so that's where sort of PageSpeed analysis comes in, where you can use that and say, well, okay, what did Mod PageSpeed or an automated tool not get, and what additional opportunity is there for improvement? Did you?
No, I don't know.
So I'll go ahead and run analysis here. So this is developers.google. You can get here currently developers.google.com/pagespeed. But we have a longer URL as well. And so what we see here is essentially, we go out, we actually fetch the page, we render the whole thing in a browser inside our production environment, and we analyze all the content, analyze the headers, analyze the DOM, etc., and we come back and give some feedback. So the first thing that we sort of give is a high-level indicator of how much slower or faster the page could be, the page speed score. And this isn't actually a measure of absolute fastness or slowness at all. That's really where web page test comes into play. If you want to know, well, how absolutely fast am I on this connection from this location? What we're about, or what PageSpeed analysis focuses on, is telling you, roughly how much opportunity there is for improvement. So a high score means that there's nothing we know about anyway that you could do to make your page faster, where the lower score indicates there's more opportunity. So let's go ahead. So we've got a 76. So it's pretty good, but there's also some room for improvement. So this is a good example. And so here on the left, we've got a list of sort of prioritized suggestions. And the first one, serve scaled images, comes back and says, you could save on the amount of content downloaded. In fact, you could reduce your download size by 291K if you resize these images to the size they're displayed, to the size that they are actually displayed in the browser. And so what I will say is there are some cases where we actually don't get that right. So for instance, if you've got a small image that on mouse over pops up really big, you probably do want to fetch the full image. It's hard for us to detect that automatically, so we'll actually tell you, hey, you can make this smaller. But if most of the time, what we see is that these images can just be scaled down. You can use standard, image tools, Photoshop, GIMP, command line tools, and reduce their size. So specifically here. So one thing we don't do today that I wish we did, and that we will hopefully add soon, is give you that optimized image, right? We'd like to just resize it and say, here you go, go ahead and download it and use it on your site. We don't do that today. in the PageSpeed browser extension tools, we do some of that. On the online tool, we don't. So there's a good bit of there, removing redirects. So depending on where on the page the redirect happens, and this is where Pat's web page test analysis will come in handy, it may or may not be sort of critical to remove the redirects, but we are seeing a couple things here that stand out to me. Here we've got something that goes from delivery.switch ad hub again to delivery switch ad hub, and then back. And so at a minimum, what I like to recommend is if you're redirecting between domains, it's sometimes hard to remove that, right? You're communicating, for instance, if it's an ad impression counter.
Those are ads.
Yep. So it's hard to, you might have a counter who, is going from, A to B, and each one wants to sort of audit it. But if there are two in a row on the same host name, it's usually possible to compress those into one, right? And just do that redirect server side where you do both bits of logic. So I look for those immediately. If I've got two in a row on the same host name, try to get rid of that. So I just see a couple cases. And then why don't we, so spriting, right? So then we come back and we say, hey, you've got lots of small little images. And you would be better off reducing the number of requests issued by using CSS spriting. And so Josh will actually be able to show and talk about, and we did talk about in a bit, how you can automate that. Because spriting is one of those techniques, it's valuable, it has an impact, but it's kind of a pain, right? That's my opinion anyway. I wish it didn't, you didn't have to do it. And actually I'll show you, so one of the nice things about the Speedy protocol is multiplexing really makes sending many small resources much, much more efficient. So I'll show a nice visual demo of that a little later. It basically renders spriting much less important in my opinion. And then we can work down here, leverage browser caching, different parsing of JavaScript. I could talk about each of these, but I would start, with these three, and I think you could expect to see, you'd save, 300K, so in a 1.5 megabit connection, which is typical DSL that Pat analyzes on. Somebody do math more quickly than I can. 300 kilobytes, 1.5 megabit. 200 millis.
No, it's
Times 8, is that?
20 or 200.
20 or 200. Okay. So we could do the math, but anyway, 300K is substantial, right? So I would actually start there. That's a really straightforward up. And mod PageSpeed will automate that as well, right? In many cases. So do you want to talk a little bit about that? Sure.
Doing arithmetic is why we better at computers, right? Okay, good. So I took a, so I wanted to show you.
Do you want to display?
Oh yeah. I was assuming everybody could see what I can see. So I did a couple of things while Bryan was talking, besides of course listening to him. I started to run web page test compare, which is an instance or an interface to web page test that lets you automatically see if I ran PageSpeed service, which is kind of this mod PageSpeed thing in the cloud I referred to earlier, on your site, how much faster would it get? But I was stuck in the queue behind Pat, so it's not done yet. However, I also ran it using a mod PageSpeed. So I'm going to probably show a few things today on an instance of mod PageSpeed that I had running, and I'm using a Firefox proxy, network proxy to get to that automatically makes a copy of the website locally. So even though I don't own stadiumjourney.com, I have a copy of it now on a server somewhere. And so I can show you what does it look like with mod PageSpeed that's served from that server versus without mod PageSpeed also served from that server. And it's a Firefox proxy, and I wouldn't recommend doing speed comparisons with a stopwatch that way. It's not a good way to compare timing. But it is a good way to see what happens before and after, so we can take a quick look. We talked a little bit about spriting just now, and in fact I turned on spriting for this site and we didn't find any. However, we did, so looking at the CSS file, I'm going to get back to images in a minute. We combined all of the CSS files that were on that domain into one. We minified that into, so to remove all the white space and the comments in the CSS file, and then we also inlined a bunch of images
that were referenced from the CSS file directly into the CSS file. So now you can see that there's base 64 images directly in the CSS file. Actually, I don't know for sure, this might have already been like that, but it definitely is like that after mod page speed gets a hold of it. So if we look at the images tab and sort by size, we can kind of see, let's see, there's a total of 138 kilobytes of image resources downloaded. And then I can also show you the same thing with mod page speed off, where there's 326. What was the other one? Yeah, so we cut it by a factor of about 3. And it looks like we also cut the number of images substantially. So we achieved the benefit of spriting without actually making a formal sprite by inlining the images into the CSS file, which has the nice side effect that it also caches those images with the CSS file. So in one cacheable resource, we have the CSS file and all the images referenced from it that were smaller than a certain threshold, which in our case was 2 kilobytes.
I assume the same requirement is there that you have to find dimensions in the CSS file for you to do the inlining.
No. We do not need to know what dimensions you're going to display an image in to inline it. So it's much more flexible and robust than the spriting.
Alrighty, so I guess we'll take that for the compare in a bit after you're done with my tests. So popping it in a web page test, the first thing I usually look for is just a really quick check on the scores at the top. The caching of the static content was sort of kind of a big red flag. And just looking through, you wouldn't expect to see some of the ad stuff. It does look like some of the images, the stars for the ratings in particular, don't have any expiration on them. And some of the other images, but not all of the images on your site, look like they could use some caching headers. And then some of them have really short caching headers. Interesting that you're serving CSS from an old directory. Then usually I'll just sort of pop down and look at the waterfall from a thumbnail view to get a sort of a high-level picture of what it looks like the site's doing when it's loading. And I'm not entirely sure, it actually comes out well on the projector. The green line down at the bottom of the thumbnail is the bandwidth. And when you see it sort of flatten out like that for a while, generally you're bandwidth constrained, at least at a DSL speed, with just the amount of stuff you're delivering. And you can somewhat see that in the waterfall, that you've got the blue lines up near the top, which are your images downloading. And it's spending a fair amount of time downloading them because it's downloading them all in parallel. But then as you start getting into your beacons and your ads and all of the tracking that's on the page, you start to get into a long tail where there's not a lot going on all at the same time. It's just sort of one thing happening after another because of the redirects and the JavaScript for the beacons, depending on what happened right before it. There's not a whole lot you can do about that, unfortunately, because you don't control most of the code. That stuff doesn't, outside of the ad, the beacon stuff doesn't really impact user experience, but it will affect your onload metrics if you're tracking those, or if you have any code attached to onload as well. Looking at the actual images, so down below the waterfall there's a link you can click on to view the actual site images, just to quick eyeball and see if there's anything that looked like it's either a PNG that should be a JPEG, or something that's too big, or something that needs to be a sprite. And it looks like, in general, you did a really good job, or the site owner anyway did a really good job, although I'm not sure that this image is, and I guess Bryan touched on that this image is really that big on the site itself. It doesn't, like Josh said, he didn't find anything that could really be sprited. Potentially the star ratings could be a sprite, but not a whole lot of room there on the spriting side of things. And then looking at, so I also captured video of it, and you can see the timeline of what it looked like to the user while it was loading. And one of the things that we added recently is as you scroll back and forth on the video, you get a red line that's kind of going along in the waterfall to show you at what point it's doing. Right now it's just aligned to the left side of the film strip view, so that's 1 second right there in both the waterfall. But you can see, as far as what the user's seeing, they're not seeing a whole lot of above the fold content, the images anyway, until 2.5, 3 seconds when most of the images have downloaded. So if you could do something about prioritizing above the fold content and trying to get that rendered in beforehand, and then pull in the stuff that's below the fold, you might be able to deliver them a faster user experience above the fold. Those were the things that really jumped out at me. And I did, Chrome and IE, there's not a whole lot of measurable difference. Chrome's a little bit faster, but they both largely have the same experience. And then for some reason, the Chrome on load went out to 9 seconds, whereas the IE didn't. It finished in 5 seconds, and I believe that's most of the. Oh, you know what? It was the last visual change instead of on load. So in the film strip view, you have a couple of modes you can toggle back and forth between here. The default is the last change, which is the last time something changed on the screen, and it could be a counter somewhere or something along those lines. You can toggle it or document complete, and yeah, they both basically complete it in the same amount of time.
Thanks, Pat. I wanted to point out another interesting feature of webpagetest.org that I just took advantage of. So I ran the comparison using PageSpeed service, and I found. Actually, let's first of all look at the page, kind of the static analysis that webpagetest does. This is useful to see. So the scripted test here is using PageSpeed service as a proxy, and the unscripted one is using the origin site. And I found that the results were kind of uneven in this, but we did change the page speed score from 77 to 87 and marginally improved the caching of static content. This does 5 repetitions. I just looked at a few of the repetitions and they're not consistent with one another, which says to me there's a couple of things going on. This could be, but I don't know what the answer to that is offhand. That kind of requires that you dive deeper into what's happening on the back end of the server. And web page test is primarily a front end thing, but it's kind of your first way of kind of taking the temperature of your server and seeing what's going on. So this is the origin server and the load time on the 5 iterations that we did. So we varied from, on first view, from 6 to 11 seconds. When I see data like this, I'm not really sure if these tightly correlated images are going to stay that way or if there's kind of a regular kind of server-side disturbance going on. But the fact is that webpage just gives you really good visibility to this because you can press one button and press this button, plot full results, which shows you a scatter plot of what your load time and your time to first byte is. This looks really scattered, but it isn't that bad because this is a really small scale. It's in hundreds of milliseconds. Your start render time. But if you're interested in load time, that gives you a view of when you keep doing it, does it keep doing the same thing? And it's also a little bit random on the PageSpeed service version. So this is just a really good tool that you have easy access to see how stable your server performance is, and it's worthwhile taking a look.
And for what it's worth, it looks like the ads change between runs a little bit, so that's a big driver for variability a lot of the time. Were there any questions about it? Anyone else have something they wanted to see about that site before we jump into another one?
How do you run the 2 different tests with the one showing the service running and the one that doesn't? could you specifically show where I would click to make that happen?
So you actually have to go webpagetest.org/compare.
And you type it in.
Yeah, it's not linked to directly from the web page test UI because it's actually a front end for the PageSpeed service for demoing what the PageSpeed service performance looks like.
I just want to give a quick word to kind of position PageSpeed service and Mod PageSpeed. Mod PageSpeed is an open source Apache module, which is free to use and do with what you like, improve it, hack on it. It's useful if you have an Apache server and you want to retain control of all of your data, and it's going to always be free of charge. So PageSpeed service is a Google service that does the same, that does basically the same thing. It's not exactly the same, but it does basically the same thing, but now you're CNAMing your domain to Google, and Google serves your content for you. And you can do this even if your server is not Apache, or if your server is Apache but you don't have access to it. And then it kind of delivers your content on Google's network, which depending on where your servers are located and where your users are located may be a benefit, or it may be that the measurements are different. For example, if you measure your performance from the same server that it's running on, probably having it go through Google servers is not going to help. But if your users are more scattered, then it probably will.
Is there any possibility in future of mod PageSpeed being on, say, Nginx?
Yes, there is a possibility. Would you like to help work on that?
I should have asked probability, or when.
I definitely can't answer when, but it's one of the things that we would really like to do. We think Nginx is a great match architecturally for mod PageSpeed, in some ways better than Apache. People that run Nginx typically do it partially because it can deliver websites faster than Apache. So it is also growing in popularity and is maybe arguably coming up on the #2 server on the internet.
Actually, it's number 1.
Nginx.
I thought so. Well, and you have to be a little careful about those ranking countings because there's a whole lot of park domain stuff going on in that space.
Yes, we would like to do that. We don't have a date to announce.
Here?
Hi, we also use a lot of performance measurement tools, and some limitations that we saw them is that they cater more to kind of this HTTP GET request, as opposed to say AJAX, for example, as what we have on our site. Do you know if, say, this tool or any others can be used to measure that type of behavior?
So the question was, they use a lot of performance testing tools or services, mostly focused on HTTP GET type behaviors, and they're a AJAX application, and the tools don't necessarily fit very well. Are there tools that could work well? So web page tests can do AJAX testing. Almost all of the full browser testing products will test AJAX sites, and you can interact, you can click on buttons, you can execute JavaScript. So I haven't actually demonstrated it here yet, but there we go. In the scripting tab, there's an API that you can interact with web page test to navigate across multiple pages. You can click on mail, you can do that kind of stuff. All of the full browser testing services can do that as well. And by the way, web page test is all BSD licensed, open source, package it up, run it on your own servers kind of thing. If you want to test the actual, just the AJAX queries, any of the HTTP GET style products can do that. Depends really on kind of what level of interaction you're trying to do. We've used web page test before I came over to Google. When I was at AOL, we used it for testing the mail product, for example. which is very heavily Ajax.
Well, just to put like give specifics. For example, you go to Google and you type a query and you used to press search, but you don't anymore. Let's say you still do it, and it's the same page results, right? So there is no actual. I mean, there are GET requests that are happening, but yet you still stay on the same page. What would be a good tool to measure the actual user experience from the moment I press search to the moment all the results are rendered?
So for something like Google, where you go to the search box, type things in, and stuff just happens in the background and you get results. So these tools can do that as well. They send key presses and they don't necessarily have to wait for an onload event or anything like that. They'll just record the network activity and whatever's going on. Your best bet by far, and if you aren't already doing it, is make sure to instrument the crap out of your app in the field, because then you actually get what the users are seeing.
Which actually brings me to a follow-up question. Sorry, I don't want to make hard, but this is kind of just all related. So a lot of these tools, they focus more on measuring things like DOM ready or onload or something like that. But it doesn't necessarily correspond to actual user experience. So for example, if there are some invisible pixels or something like that might take longer to load, users are already ready to interact with the results and maybe already are using them, and maybe 5 seconds later visible pixels appear or something like that, some content.
So defining the endpoint
is there
for one of these. So I know web page test at least doesn't require you to wait for onload or DOM content ready or any of that. You can give it an arbitrary network request, an arbitrary DOM element showing up. You can even fire JavaScript if you want to tell it it's done. A lot of it's going to depend. That kind of thing becomes very application dependent though. So you're going to have to either code the testing harness around the application or the application around the testing harness to be able to interact and figure out when it should be done. A lot of the tools default to using onload and DOM content ready and that kind of event because they're universal, right? They apply to all applications. They may not be the perfect measurement for that application, but most of them can be customized to measure what you want to measure. It's just more work to do it.
There is time later, maybe it would be interesting to revisit this.
Alrighty, jumping on, way back and back.
Yeah, so you just mentioned difference between mod page speed and the Google page speed service. I'm just wondering if the page speed service is the beginning of Google's ambition to be CDN. And if there are page limits, or is it free right now that are will it cost money in the future if it's extra popular?
For the moment, there's no charge, but Google is not going to be able to scale up to serving the internet for free.
So I think that's true. We're still figuring out, what the story is there. But I think I want to frame that a little bit by saying, our primary motivation, so when we introduced the three of us, none of us actually said, but I think it's important to say, the group we work in is called Make the Web Faster, and that is our primary goal and motivation. And so we see this as an opportunity to do just that by providing a really easy to use service. But we can't do that for free, most likely. I mean, we don't know what the pricing model looks like, but so our goal is not to be a CDN, but rather to make the web faster. And we're still figuring out exactly what that means, but you can count on us to prioritize making the web faster ahead of everything else.
I'll add to that Google likes to kind of demonstrate what it thinks are the right way to do things and encourage others in the industry to do so. And I think Chrome was a good example of that. And I think in the CDN space, we're starting to see, and I'm not saying that it's because of us, but we're very happy that it's happening, that we've seen numerous acquisitions of web performance optimization companies by content delivery networks. Akamai has bought Blaze, Limelight bought AcceloWeb, and Riverbed bought Optimize.
Yeah. And level 3 partners with StrangeLoop. Sorry, and level 3 partners with StrangeLoop on their offering. So there's starting to see a lot of synergies between the web optimization and the CDNs as well.
One other thing to add is that we're actively trying to work with partners to deploy the mod PageSpeed technology, the PageSpeed optimization libraries. And the first of those was called FastSoft, which is a Caltech startup that works in the networking space and found that they had great synergy with mod PageSpeed.
So I mentioned Speedy a couple times earlier. I'd like to take a few minutes just to talk a little bit more about that and mod Speedy and sort of what the benefits you might get from using Speedy in your site. So first up, Speedy. So if you search, use your favorite search engine to search for mod Speedy. SPDY, pronounced Speedy. You will find our open source code project. So the whole thing is open source. And what I'd like to, so Speedy is a protocol that runs over SSL. So it works in the browser sort of transparently to you whenever you go to an HTTPS URL. And I actually have up here this little icon, which is a Chrome extension, which tells you whether or not Speedy is on for any given site. So this site, because it's not over HTTPS, is not Speedy enabled. But so I don't know if code.google supports SSL. Let's find out. But just by switching over to HTTPS, now we can see that actually this whole thing is being served over Speedy. So what does that mean for the site? So there are various benefits you get from Speedy. Two of the most important are multiplexing and header compression. And so we put together this nice little demo, which I can actually show live as well, but I'll just show the video, that shows sort of what that amounts to. So this is a page that, to some extent, we crafted to show the benefits of Speedy specifically. So you're not going to see this level of improvement on your site necessarily, but it should give you an idea of, how Speedy is more efficient and what that can translate into in terms of user experience. So we'll just watch this video real quick. So on the right is the Speedy enabled server, and on the left is just plain HTTPS. So we saw an over 2x improvement there. And so what's going on is multiplexing allows us to send requests and responses back and forth between the server much more efficiently, and header compression allows us to reduce the cost of each of those requests. And so earlier we talked about, we don't like spriting, right? Spriting is kind of frustrating. So if you deploy Speedy, it effectively I don't want to say it renders spriting unnecessary, but it greatly reduces the benefit. You could alternatively sprite all these images right into one big sprite and display them and all of that. If you just deploy Speedy, you can think of it as taking care of some of these things for you at sort of the transport layer, I guess, lower level in the stack. Let's see, so why don't I show just real quick how you can download and install Speedy to enable Speedy on your site. Why don't we do this? So here's the actual demo, right? It's currently Speedy enabled. So I actually have a connection here. I'm going to disable. So I've now, turned A2 dysmod is the sort of Ubuntu Debian way to turn off a module. So I've turned off the module, I restarted. Let's go ahead and reload, and we'll watch this sort of come in. Right, so that's no Speedy. There might be. Let's try this again. So can I hand this to you for a second? So I'm going to flush the.
Gonna flush the cache.
No terminals. Speedy. Over, clear the. I'm not sure we can flush them. That's an exciting feature. All right, so let's try this again. So that extension kind of is a little flaky, because it doesn't expect the website to turn Speedy off halfway through. That's sort of an atypical thing to happen. So let's open it in a new tab. Wow, this is fantastic. Sorry.
See how slow it is without
I know, right? Amazing. Unfortunately, that has nothing to do with. All right, so here we go. So this is, you can see the icon says Speedy is off, and so we saw it sort of trickle in, right? So let's go ahead and turn it on. So A2nmod enable, and now let's do the same reload, and hopefully, so there you go, right? Much faster, right? Well, I think that's the extension actually lying to us. So let's go ahead and do this in a new tab again. Obviously, okay, so that we need to actually hit the network to see the effect. Why are you lying to me? All right, let's figure this out. I don't know. So what I can, so there are other ways we can see.
So I think I turned
He just turned it on.
So what we can do is we can go in here, and actually, so ModSpeedy, when it's enabled, we'll put a header, a response header on it, so we can see X ModSpeedy. So the extension's lying, because I didn't write the extension. It's a neat thing, but it's not quite perfect. So we can see here X ModSpeedy indicates that, in fact, this is served over speedy. And hopefully, you can, I certainly could see the visual difference, right? This was, just much faster than the HTTPS only. So hopefully you can see that too. Yeah, so ModSpeedy is open source. You can, search for ModSpeedy, go ahead and either download packages. I'll go ahead and just show how easy that is to install too.
Question?
Yeah.
Can the output of Speedy be cached by intermediate proxies?
No, it can. The current incantation is sort of how proxies work. It doesn't, because it's over SSL, it's sort of necessarily end-to-end. I think that's an interesting, so I think there's a larger discussion going on right now as sort of the next generation HTTP gets standardized, what that should look like. Should it be speedy? Should it be a speedy-like thing? There we go. Should it be over SSL or not? What should caching look like? And so actually, it's an exciting time to get involved and watch these discussions, participate, give feedback, because I think this is, in the next year or maybe 2 years, I don't know, will really define what the next generation of HTTP looks like. So I guess I didn't. The short answer is no. It doesn't play well with caching. But what I will say is many CDNs do actually support, as I understand it, HTTPS CDN. So you can deploy your content over HTTPS on, I suppose that's not really directly related. We'll rewind about 10 seconds. Go ahead.
Does Speedy work within all existing standards, or is it an extension?
So it certainly works at top TCP, so it doesn't do anything sort of, it just uses standard TCP. But above that, it has an HTTP 1.1-like API, but it sort of transforms the requests and responses into a binary protocol on the wire between client and server. So so what we did actually in ModSpeedy is actually, the whole of Apache is implemented in terms of HTTP 1.1, and so what we did is essentially take Speedy in off the network and spit out HTTP 1.1 on the other side and let the rest of Apache sort of process that. And they're designed to sort of interplay. So one goal of Speedy is to make sure that it's compatible, backward compatible with 1.1 as I understand it. So I'll just go ahead and install. So it's literally, so I've downloaded the Debian package, installed. It's that easy. It seems to be terminating the download. Let's see if, I don't know. It's supposed to be that easy, I apologize. Live demo.
I just
but
installed it, it was easy.
Yeah, download, install, reload the page. I would like to show you, that on this server I just sort of made it work, but unfortunately that's not the case. But it normally is that easy. So, search for ModSpeedy, install it. You have to be running SSL, but if you're doing that, it's a super easy thing for Apache.
Can you compare speed performance to HTTP non-secure performance?
Yeah, so you can think of HTTPS as costing an extra round trip, but otherwise performance should be the same. Now, in fact, what we see is that due to the way OpenSSL works right now, in some cases we don't always get that. It actually tends to be even a little more costly. But we're working on making sure that all the implementations are effectively an additional round trip at the initial part of the connection. And then we sort of think of that as a cost you do pay for another benefit here, which is the secure connection. So if you're Mike Belshe's kind of the speedy, I don't know what you call it, the speedy champion. He's the guy who sort of sent an email out one day at work. He said, "Hey, I have this idea for this new protocol. Here's how it's going to work." And I was like, "That's nuts. That's never going to work." And so he proved me wrong, which is fantastic. And he's very advocate because we're running over SSL, you get benefits around security and privacy, right? So if you're in a cafe, right, the person next to you can't snoop your content. And so that's sort of the overhead that you end up paying in that case, is the extra round trip.
As far as browser support, because I know that some of the newer versions like Chrome and Firefox support Speedy,
but it's not necessarily all browsers, correct?
Yep, that's right. And I think what we'll see is, as HTTP2 takes form and becomes standardized, we'll see all the browsers standardize around that. In the meantime, you've got Chrome, which is what, 25% of the market share. Firefox and Firefox 13 will turn it on, as I understand, by default, and that's another 25%. So you're looking at 50% there. And then Chrome on Android supports it. So it's, it's not everywhere yet, but we're already at 50%. And when we talk about sort of new features on the web, that's actually a pretty amazing percentage, right? Like usually it's like, oh wow, this new HTML5 thing, it works in, the dev channel of Chrome for months and months. But
what about IE? Do you know if anything?
I don't know. They're participating in the HTTP 2.0 discussion, and they have some ideas that are speedy-like, but with some other. My expectation is that as that standardizes, they'll support whatever the standard comes out to be.
And it is important to note it. I mean, it's completely compatible and backward compatible with everything out there. So by turning it on, you're not breaking any other browsers. Other browsers that are talking HTTPS will continue to do it completely transparently like they would before. It's just the browsers that do support Speedy will be a lot faster. So anyone have more URLs? So we can jump into some more URLs. No one has sites that, well, way back and back.
Mesh ASH01.
01, the numbers, not ZERO.
Yeah, no.
Okay. Mesh01.com. No one wants to put their screen up first. So first I usually load the site up in the browser to make sure we get it with the right redirects. Because, well, I probably don't want to test the /form/home, but I'll at least give it the www benefit of the doubt. Because sometimes you'll get cases where you're testing the bare domain and not www, and you'll have the extra redirect penalty in your measurements. And odds are you probably don't want to include that in your testing. And I do recommend usually if you're using web page test to run more than one. 2 or 3 is a good number, especially if you're looking for the timings, just because you will see a lot of variability potentially. And it's actually something to watch out for as well. If your first test of your first run has a much longer time than the rest, especially time to first byte, there may be some back-end caching that you need to look at, where the first time it hit the page, it had to do all the database queries and everything else, and then the second and third times everything was cached in RAM. So it's just, you want to look at more than just one sample, and also don't freak out if one sample's taking a really long time. Oh, hey, look, really long time to first byte. So most of the tools we're looking at here are generally front-end tools, and they'll tell you your back-end has issues you should look at. They won't tell you what those issues are. Unfortunately, we don't have any visibility into that from the outside. But so when you're looking at the thumbnail, and it's still running the tests, but the first line, which has it's a really bad yellow on the projector, but trust me, that's yellow highlighting on the first line. Anything that's highlighted in yellow is a 300 series response. In this case, it's a redirect. Generally, yellows are warnings, things that you probably shouldn't see. Reds are errors, 404s more often than not. So you can get a lot from the thumbnail, but one of the things that you'll see is when you have a really long green line at the beginning, there's a back-end issue you probably want to look at, because over half of the 7 seconds for the page load was spent on the back-end server side. And Steve Souders, who we work with a lot, does talk a lot about the 80-20 rule, where 80% of the time is spent on the front end. That's certainly the case for a lot of sites on the internet. That's not the case for all sites. So if you do have a long first byte time, fix that first, because until you actually get the HTML out to the user, they can't get anything else. The browsers, all of the predictive fetching and everything else that the browsers are going to do, they can't start on that until they have something to work on. It looks like caching is working really well though, browser caching, because the repeat view waterfall is a whole lot shorter than the first view, so you're not serving a lot of content, which is good. I don't know that that necessarily means there's a long cache time. We'll wait till it, yep, caching static content. Yeah, so the big red F on the first byte time, just in case you didn't know you wanted to look at it. After that, so we can zoom into it, but it does look like after the first byte and the content starts to come in, the bandwidth is pretty well pegged at the 1.5 megabit, so it's pretty much using the pipe up really well, which is a good sign. At that point, you kind of want to look at, do you really need to deliver all of that? Something that's jumping out just by looking at the file names is there's a lot of PNGs here, which are probably worthy of being sprited. We can take a look at I usually pop into the image view really quickly just to see if anything jumps out. And yeah, so like these social buttons. Okay, yeah. Oh, that's a big image. Yeah, and all of these down here, the profile icons, portfolio icon, competitions icon. So each one of those icons, instead of being separate icon files, should probably be combined into an icons sprite of some kind. One thing Bryan was talking about, so like he was saying early on, one of the integrations we did was with page speed. So you can get your full page speed checked directly from web page test as well, which does a lot more in-depth analysis of your site than web page test with the grades at top. And yeah, so the image combining into the CSS sprites are definitely called out. Although it doesn't look like it pegged the icons. So there's some things that automated detection just isn't as good at as looking at as humans are. So I definitely recommend, don't necessarily, the scores and the checks and all of that are good indicators and good things to look at, but learn to read the waterfalls. If you don't already, the waterfalls will tell you sort of really what's going on, what's getting loaded, how it's getting loaded. Yeah, so I mean, back-end time, ooh, you've got a fair amount of JavaScript that's loading up at the front. This IE CSS worries me a little bit. Just, hang on, I want to look at the site source really quickly. Yeah, so Bryan was mentioning you can flush, if you do have a back-end issue that is maybe more difficult to optimize for, especially if you're calling out to a third-party service or something like that, one of the things that you can do is flush out at least the head, or as much as you can before you make any of those slow calls to give the browser some content to work on. Okay, so here, one of the things to watch out for, and this is actually a really easy fix, is IE conditional comments in your code have a nasty habit in IE of causing IE to block at that point. So it won't prefetch anything after the conditional comment, and it'll stop execution until everything before the conditional comment's been downloaded. And the solution is to put a completely empty conditional comment up at the top of your HTML, and that tricks IE into not blocking anymore. This is the world we live in. So that's a real easy fix. That'll get rid of a block, and it'll actually it pops it up here. Oh yeah. So Stoyan had a really good article, and on the web page test screen while it's running your test, there's a little tips box that has all of 3 tips it rotates through. This is one of the tips that it'll link you to. But if you look at the waterfall right here at around request 11, where it downloads some stuff and then it stops doing anything and then it downloads the rest of it, getting rid of the conditional comment should get rid of that break there and move everything back over and load everything in parallel. I think that's it on my side. I'll take it over.
You go first.
So I was just going to ask, so server-side performance is actually not an area that we spend a lot of time looking at. I'm curious, are there tools here that people use to sort of understand what's going on in the server, you know, where time is being spent? Are there tools you recommend to other developers here?
So this is the one I use for web page test. I use New Relic and Dynatrace are sort of the two big app performance monitors, the back-end drilling tools that I'm aware of anyway. Beyond instrumenting your code and MySQL slow query logs and that kind of stuff. The main thing I get out of this is it'll tell me what PHP functions are taking how much time, the database queries, what are the slow queries, how often they're getting hit. Let's see, there's an app server. So it gives you front-end performance globally as well as back-end. So thanks to the tool, web page test is now running really fast, but the server response times are around 7 milliseconds now for web page test. Yeah, it didn't always used to be that. It used to be up in the 120 millisecond range, but when we launched the web page test / compare, we had a little bit of a freak out. Well, I had a little bit of a freak out because, you know, Google's announcing a service and it's going to be tested using web page test, and I'm like, ugh, I can't handle that kind of load. So we did a whole lot of back-end optimization to make sure it could handle the load.
There's actually a new company in Boston called Tracealytics. Does the same kind of thing?
Tracealytics?
They might actually have some guys here today. I don't know. Hey, there you go.
See him back and back. Especially the Mesh01 site owner.
Nobody's going to volunteer to keep making fun of.
Let's see. So we've talked about flushing. Very. How many people know? Are you familiar with what that means? Sort of flushing content. So if you search for what did I search for? Flushing the document early. There's a nice article by Steve Souders that talks about it. I believe, so what it's doing is, you know, you generate some content. You can think of your HTML response as a screen. You know, there's a byte after byte after byte, but there's one header in the HTTP response at the beginning that sort of breaks that, and that is the content length header. The content length header has to know precisely how long the document is before it can send any document out, which means you have to, by default, buffer the whole thing server side. So what you can use instead is called, chunked encoding. Chunked encoding, which is a way of basically adding a content length to each chunk in a response. And so you can say, I've generated this much content so far, I'm going to push that down, and then I've generated this much, here's that, et cetera, until you send like an empty chunk at the end. It's just not basically done. And so what you can do is in your code, if you're using PHP, for instance, I think it's, what's the function of PHP? PHP flush. That will say, you know,
plus PD flush plus.
To do 3 flush.
So I don't write PHP, but okay. So you'd have to do some research around that. But you know, if you understand how your app works and which is fast and which is slow, you can, right after the fast part, you can call the flush function. That will send that to the client right away. The nice side effect of that is that usually these resources, right, the CSS, the JS, etc., are in the head. Oh, well. These resources, that's right. So these, you know, CSS and JS, jQuery, etc., are almost certainly declared really early in the document in that first chunk that is safe to flush and it doesn't need to be blocked on. So what you'd see instead is all these fetches. If you push them down in the first chunk, you'd see them all move in over here. Now, eventually, anything that's loaded, you know, as a result of that backend call that's really expensive is going to be over here. But you might get your first paint to happen, you know, over here just by flushing the document early. So I definitely recommend that for this sake.
One thing to mention about that is it flushes the 200 to the browser as well. So if you monitor for response codes, that can cause some issues.
You're saying like if it ends up failing and you want to undo that, there's no way.
Yeah, if you have like a server error later on in the page, it'll flush the 200 and then you won't ever see that in your report. But hopefully not a lot of 500 in your site.
That's a good point. So you're giving up the ability to change the response code by flushing.
Redirects as well.
And headers.
Yeah.
You also can change any headers after you flush. Just one of the things that jumped out at me as well is the purple bars here and the little lock icons on the left mean it's an SSL request. I'm not sure if you really want to be serving, it looks like there's 3 or 4 images, JPEG images, that are being served over SSL. Not sure if that's intentional or not, but if not, it's probably something to look at as well.
Those stood out for me as well. In fact, this comes up. We have those same 3 images show up in Firebug. And in fact, in order to get mod PHP to rewrite them correctly, I had to map them to HTTP, which is a relatively new feature. I think we put it in last September, which mod PHP supports HTTPS, but it does so by mapping resources either to HTTP, so that mod PHP can find them, or to the file system. And so while we were talking here, I just did that little mapping so I could rewrite this site. But it definitely stands out that these 3 not only are involved getting the SSL stack involved in browsing of this site, which is otherwise served on HTTP, but it takes 2.5 to 3 seconds to bring them over. So looks like we get about, including those images, we get 444 kilobytes downloaded, and mod page speed, we bring it down to 162. And there's a lot less images, again, because we inline them into CSS files or into HTML. So that's really kind of the nuts and bolts of the most basic things that mod PHP does, which is less bytes, less requests. And in this case, we also had to do a mapping so we could do it at all. But once we were able to map it, we could take those SSL images, serve them in 300 milliseconds instead of 2.5 to 3 seconds, and get them in about 60K. Should we go into the new site?
I understand that internally Google is rolling all of the JavaScript stacks into one, so the closure, closure, compiler, with support, can be rebuilt as a single unified JavaScript stack. I'm just wondering if this is going, if any of these PHP libraries are going to be something built into that. Maybe some of these things already with, for example, hashing resource URLs, right? I'm just wondering if the kind of techniques here are also rolled into the stacks that would with that.
That's a good question. I think that mod PageSpeed and PageSpeed Service and GWT share motivations and methodologies, but not at this moment, to my knowledge, code. The main thing, so the real difference between GWT and tools like in the PageSpeed family is that GWT is a way to build new websites using tools that are kind of designed for this. And what we're trying to work with is a tool that will automatically take existing websites and transform them into what you want, into ones that will be served fast. And those are both valid techniques. If you have a large body of code that's not GWT, then one of these tools is better to do the transformation. But if you're going to build something using the GWT methodology, then probably a lot of these techniques are less necessary.
So do you guys want to talk about caching? Like, does the module do some kind of caching, and how do you manage that? Or
Browser caching?
No, like server side.
Yeah. So mod PageSpeed has to actually depends on its own caching infrastructure to do almost anything, at least anything with resources. In order to serve an optimized resource, mod PageSpeed will initiate based on learning about that resource and asynchronous fetch of that resource, so it can get that resource into its own memory, and then kind of in the background, we'll optimize it and put it in cache. So there's a cache in the server. There are also Apache caches that are independent of mod PageSpeed, and there's Varnish. And mod PageSpeed kind of works really well, actually works really well with Varnish. People use that combination pretty successfully in the field. I'm not too aware of people using mod PageSpeed with mod cache or mod memcache. But mod PageSpeed uses its own disk-based cache, which can be put on a tempfs to make it really fast, and it also caches in memory, but much less.
What was the time? Jonathan, what time constraints do we have?
Yeah, so I don't know how we're doing on time. I would think it would be like 5 more minutes, and then we'll see where we're at.
Sure.
Why don't we do one more site and then we'll do some closing demos?
Sure. Sounds good.
Who's got a site?
Cruises only.
CRUISESONLY.
This time you get to see Josh.
Can you repeat, what is it?
Cruise is CRUISESONLY.
It's www. Which defaults to /default.
Okay, I should have said that into a run.
So I'll just talk real quick. So a couple things. So page speed report here. It looks like there are a bunch of resources that don't have caching headers, so or have short cache lifetimes. JS pop-up and other things are cached for 5 minutes. And so what you'll see is, every 5 minutes, or so the user has to re-download all those resources, and that, so if you've got users who are coming back often, setting those to more aggressive caching headers and using mod PageSpeed with its ability to sort of fingerprint resources will make that actually really easy for you. So in fact, you could just install mod, if you happen to run Apache, you could just install mod PageSpeed and this would mostly take care of itself, I believe. Combine images into CSS sprites, same sort of thing. Minimize redirects. Looks like a lot of ad stuff. It looks like we're responsible for some of that. Which actually, so we constantly see, as we work on, as we build this app right here, PageSpeed Online, or, we work with this other team, there are always trade-offs, right? Your goal, sometimes I talk to people and they're like, oh, my goal is to get 100 on PageSpeed, and that's great, but I would actually recommend that you, think about, where are the big wins, and, where is my, where does it make sense for me to implement things, and which are the things that, yeah, they would be great, right, but they're really hard to do, and I just, I'll settle for, an 85 or a 90 score. There are things about this app and the way it works and the framework that it uses that I'm actually not happy with, but it's really hard for me to do anything about that. And so, we make compromises around that. Servers, this is an interesting one. So what we see here actually is that these resources have very similar URLs. So here's one with a capital code and a lowercase code. And it's the same response, so we look at the body and we compare them. But, because the URL is different, you don't get caching benefits. You end up fetching those twice. So, there's a couple of resources here. And then this message box one, it has different paths. And that one looks like it's very, a capital J versus a lowercase j. So using the same URL there will help. And then, I usually focus on the high priority stuff. And if you address all those things, you'd expect to see your score come up in the 90 range. Which is what I consider to be sort of, I'm done. Like, I don't optimize to 100. I mean, I might occasionally, but it's not the best use of time.
So I was looking at the HTML to actually look for something else, and got a little worried because all of this is coming before the HTML tag. Might be something you want to take a look at. I'm not sure what it's supposed to be doing or if it'll actually work. I'm assuming the browser is trying to do something intelligent with it, and it's probably creating, and moves the head up above all of that. But you probably want to clean that up.
So I don't know which tags trigger which behavior, but if you put something like a div in the head, the browser will say, that doesn't look like it belongs in the head, and it will start the body early. It will sort of restructure its DOM internally. And so this iframe here in the no script may actually trigger that as well. And there are, performance implications around, being in the head versus being in the body. But it's just a good thing to be aware of in general. Like if you, looked for this iframe to be in the head, you might not find it. It might be in the body.
Probably also should figure out if you really want your JavaScript, your jQuery in particular, to be the first thing you're loading. I'm not sure what other code on the site depends on it, but if you could move that down as far as possible, loading it asynchronously would be really nice, but that's usually sometimes very difficult. I was looking for, because it looked like there were a fair number of third-party JavaScripts, but I'll look for those. Oh, here we go. No, those are all. So the +1 button has an async script, so please switch to the async loader. I thought I saw that pop up. So eventually it'll be available. I have a Chrome plugin I'm working for, which will tell you the potential third-party blocking scripts. So just some of the things you want to look for. And analytics, if it's not already, also has an async script. So one of the things when you're looking at the waterfalls, that's a long waterfall. So it's loading a lot of stuff. In this case, 175 requests, 1.4 meg. One of the things that jumped out at me really early was this really long blue line up here, but it doesn't look like it's blocking the onload, and it looks like it's completely async, and it's a beacon. I'd still be worried about why it's taking 10 seconds for the beacon to fire or to get responded to, well, to get redirected to something else that does something. Because you may be losing some of your analytics just from people bailing before the beacon completes processing. I assume these are a lot of the sprite things that Bryan pointed out. So looking at the waterfall, down here wherever you start to see stair-step things kind of going off to the side like that, that's generally an indicator of a lot of small files that probably don't need to be discrete, separate small files. The red line means something that you intended to work didn't. In this case, it's a 404 for non-existent image for IE6. Maybe it worked exactly as you intended. Never seen that before. Although I have seen cases where someone would attach on-error handlers to images and have, like for profile pics, and if the file was there, great, a profile pic showed up, and if not, an empty profile pic would show up. But unfortunately, those don't get cached, so every time someone's hitting it, the browser's making all of those requests, hitting all those 404s. If you can find a solution that actually gets cached and gives you the same benefit of what you're trying to do, that would be best. We've sort of backed off on recommending combining JavaScript and CSS because browsers with the 6 parallel connections can actually tend to be somewhat faster downloading them in parallel. This may be a little more than you want to do separately though. You just have somewhere on the order of 8 JavaScript and CSS files each, or more JavaScript, fewer CSS. Probably collapse that down to maybe 3 or 4 max if you can. Preferably get as many of them out of blocking and out of the head as possible. So the +1 button, for example, no question. If you can combine some of like your message box with these events, some of your libraries, if you can combine the smaller libraries together, that would help a lot. Probably worth looking at the code, and I won't look at it right now, but it kind of looks like before the double-click thing starts loading, you sort of stop seeing things stack on top of each other, and it looks like there's a break going on in the waterfall where nothing's happening. It did a bunch of stuff, nothing happening, and then it's doing a bunch more stuff. There's probably something in the HTML code that's causing that, like we saw earlier with the IE conditional comment. There's a couple of other fringe cases that can cause that. I can't remember what they are off the top of my head. So lots of tracking pixels. I mean, certainly sprites would be a very big thing to look at. Pop open the images really quickly. Hey, look, lots and lots of tiny. I thought those were tracking pixels for a minute, but there's actually a little bit of an image in there. Yeah, so either CSS or something like mod page speed or something that'll inline them for you for the more modern browsers. One of the things to watch out for with CSS sprites anyway is accessibility. There are techniques for doing image-based sprites that maintain the accessibility, but when you go into high contrast mode, the background images all disappear, so you don't want to have anything navigational in a background image generally. And that's sort of one of the other reasons that inlining becomes a whole lot easier. Lots of 0K images. And a whole bunch of Google ad ones. Well, that's a sprite, so at least all of those images are combined into a single sprite, plus one sprite. Looks like the different cruise lines are certainly worthy of being in a sprite. And certainly all of these, looks like cell phone number kind of things, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all of those should definitely be in a sprite. And you probably want to organize the sprites logically and not necessarily combine everything into a single sprite. The awards. So I'm willing to bet you could probably get rid of maybe half of the requests just by spriting some of the image sets. And that's probably the first thing. I'd focus on that and making as much of the JavaScript async as you can. And then combining the CSS and JavaScript or getting as much of that out of the head as possible. And figuring out what's causing this block right here, because you really want the browser to start downloading as much of the user visible content as possible, as early on as possible. Just really quick. Yeah, so, I mean, the screen's blank for the first 4 seconds. So, and then at 5 seconds, pretty much everything pops. So where the red line is right now, everything before that is stopping the page from rendering. That's quite a bit of stuff. Sure.
If I could ask just a quick question, and this may be a bit of a silly question, but I'm wondering if you think it would be faster for things like the phone numbers to do that with just CSS or to do an inline image with CSS or an inline sprite?
Yes, I didn't actually see, they looked like phone number touchpads, but I didn't know what it was actually doing on the page. And Stoyan, was it Stoyan? No. Someone at Yahoo did a fairly good experiment with CSS3 versus images. And at some level, doing simple things with CSS is good. Trying to do something complicated, sometimes you end up with CSS that's bigger than the image and doesn't actually work well in all the browsers.
Sure.
So don't go completely over. Marcel.
Okay, so I've been struggling with this site, especially to do something in a couple of minutes. Just before I got the monitor switch, I was able to get the web page test results from the page speed service back, and it looks like there was some speed up on first view and some degradation on repeat view, but there's a lot of variability, there's a lot of ads. I haven't dived into it yet. I was looking at this in mod page speed as well, and I tried to combine JavaScript and that helped. It doesn't combine everything, and it combines things in multiple, like here is one line that combines probably about 8 JavaScript files, and here's another one that combines a few more. My page speed will put a limit by default of I forget, there's some limitation in various proxies about how big it can make URLs, so my page speed will stop combining into one set and make a new set. So it'll break down large numbers into smaller numbers, which is generally pretty good. Actually, this is an area that we're working on actively, is to tune our system, because right now, when we first put it out, we just did as much as possible everywhere it was legal. And we're trying to move into a world where we're trying to do things that actually we measure as benefits. So,
I have a quick question about these. Is there a reason why you don't like MD5 to the URL or something to keep it a consistent length while also getting the right content?
yeah, we, in order to support multi-server setups where they don't share a cache or a file system or a database or anything, we have to be able to, from the URL, reconstruct everything that went into it. So we can't lose any data. We do use MD5 sums for the content hash to help make them cache for a long time. So I noticed this. I noticed that that mod page speed on this site does not do what I was hoping it would for CSS files. It combines and minifies some of them, but it leaves a whole bunch of them unchanged. And that's something that we're going to hang on to the site and take a look at why that's not happening. It's probable that there's some CSS3 constructs that we don't understand, and we're saying, rather than mess this file up, we're going to leave it alone. And so we're leaving, and because of that, I think we're leaving a lot of image optimization on the table as well. But overall, mod PageSpeed does reduce the number of requests and number of bytes downloaded on this site a lot. There's still a long way to go. What else? Okay, I think that's all I have right now for this site. The site definitely has a lot that can be worked on, both from the tool perspective and probably trimming it down. I thought I would see. Does anybody else have want to do kind of a wrap up? Oh, I know what I wanted to say. There was something else that I had on this. So we mentioned moving JavaScript down below, because right now, so browsers will kind of block when they have to download and execute JavaScript. My PageSpeed service have a new experimental filter called Defer JavaScript, which just does that. It tries to, and this is kind of an aggressive filter. We'll probably never turn it on by default like some of our other filters, but it tries to move JavaScript below so that it doesn't impact page load, and it does have a dramatic impact on page load time and on time to visibility, but there are also things that it can do that in some cases might change the behavior of the page in ways that you don't want. But it's something that people are working on pretty intensively because it has huge benefit. And I encourage all site owners that want to investigate it to turn it on and see what it does. It may have a bigger impact than almost anything else that they can do, especially if there's large numbers of JavaScript files loaded at the top of the page.
So we're trying to bring up some pages or some Twitter accounts to follow. Bryan will pop it over there. So one of the things that we're working on doing is we're going to hold more of these in sort of smaller sessions, or well, I guess it could be bigger depending on how many people turn out. But in Google Hangouts, we'll be having sort of regular. We'll go out and hang out. Anyone who wants to pop by and talk about sites or stuff that they want to look at, we'll be there to talk about it in a hangout. We'll get them announced sort of to all of the feeds that we possibly can. PageSpeed is certainly a good one to listen to. Our group, so me, Pat Meenan, I'll certainly be announcing them. We also have a Make the Web Fast MTWFG Twitter handle, which is the Make the Web Faster official Twitter feed. And then also on Google+, patmeenan@gmail.com. And I'm assuming, at least when I do Hangouts, that's where I'll be coming from. I think that's mostly what I had. Jonathan?
That's a bus wrap off.
Yep, some books now.